Housing affordability, for real. Understanding the problem, driving forward the solution. Andrew D. Atkin, 20th of October 2014, and my blog is Building Utopia if you want to Google for that for a lot more information. Take a look at this home. It has 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. It's selling for $240,000 based on the early 2013 New Zealand dollar. It's a typical home selling for a typical price. Not in New Zealand, but in Houston, Texas. If you don't believe that you can buy properties like this at that price, then I urge you to do a Google search on properties for sale in Houston today. See for yourself. Houston is not economically depressed. Far from it. Houston is actually America's standout economy. Houston is growing so fast that Houston City alone issues more home building consents than the entire state of California. Houston has over 6 million residents today. Note that when wages are normalized to living costs, Houston actually offers the highest living standard in America. It's hard to be poor in Texas. Being able to buy a new home in Houston on working class wages, that New Zealanders would describe as a mansion, is a major factor in this. It should be no surprise that Americans are voting with their feet and flooding into Texas today. So what on earth happened? How has Houston come to make a mockery out of the New Zealand property market? This simple graph says it all. $800 per square metre for Houston, $2,500 per square metre for Christchurch, and $3,500 per square metre for Auckland. This is the all-up, including serviced section, new build cost of an average Houston home, compared to the averages of 2 key New Zealand markets, Christchurch and Auckland. It costs about 4 times the amount to build a comparable home in Auckland as it does in Houston, when comparing apples to apples. It never used to be this way. First, it's important to understand the importance of new build costs. If you can build a new house at a respectable price, then it becomes impossible for the housing market overall to inflate much, and no matter the changes in demand or people's access to credit. Think about this. Who on earth would pay $600,000 for a rundown old home when they can build a new one for less than half of that, just 1 or 2 kilometres down the road on the city fringe? No surprises. As consistently and empirically observed everywhere, property markets only inflate when the new build costs are inflated. Hence, the heart of achieving housing affordability is rooted in getting the cost of house building down. It's not really about supply as such. It's about why we're not getting the supply. And again, that comes down to the cost of construction. Make housing cheap to build again, and you will get your building boom, and in response to any increase in demand. The New Zealand nightmare. Now, rather than reducing house building costs, we in New Zealand have artificially inflated them. We have done this primarily, though not exclusively, by inflating the cost of land, by artificially restricting its supply. We have taken the raw land cost on the city fringes, which should be about $30,000 or so for a quarter-acre section, and in Auckland we have turned it into more like a $400,000 section. Let me explain how exactly this works. Take a hypothetical city. The city would have gone through some normal expansion as it grew over the years, especially in response to automobiles, which revolutionized urban dwellers' access to space and fresh air. Now, the planners come along and decide that we are consuming too much space and that we would be better off going back to high-density living. In turn, they cap the land supply by enforcing what is called a Metropolitan Urban Limit, or MUL for short, which is now often called Rural Urban Boundary, or RUB for short. I'll stick with the MUL. The new regulatory regime dictates that all new urban development must exist within the MULs. Refer to the image. All urban development must then exist inside the white circle. This means, of course, that all the land on the outside of the circle cannot compete for sales to people wanting to build homes. So the land supply becomes monopolized by the lucky people who happen to own land within the MUL. Now, there is an important secondary reaction to the enforcement of MULs. People in the property game who understand what's going on see an easy opportunity to get very rich, and for doing nothing productive at all, I will add. They rapidly start buying up land within the MULs or hold on to the land they already own. This is called land banking. Land bankers hold on to land and only drip feed it into the market to keep the price up, dramatically up. And land bankers do this because they know that they don't have to compete with people selling land for development outside the metropolitan urban limits, of which would otherwise overwhelm the land banking game. So, once the land banking is set in, the iron grip on land supply has been created. From here, the progression to radically unaffordable housing begins. In New Zealand, it started way back in the 1990s, and today the cancer has reached full bloom, as we know. Your $40,000 section on the Auckland fringe is now going for about $400,000. To further clarify, because there is never enough land to meet growing demand, the bidding war for the land that is available becomes intense. Consumers compete against each other with pretty much all the disposable income they have to try and buy a section. Somebody has to miss out, and they don't want it to be them. Now, if the average home buyer comes into more money from economic growth, or more money from government home buying subsidies, then that money just gets sucked up into the never-ending bidding war on land. The same can be said for any other house building saving on any other level. If the cost of physical house construction falls, for example, or the city council stops asking for unfair development contributions, etc., then those savings put more money into the home buyer's pocket, which in turn gets converted into even more gains in land prices. This is why in artificially land-restricted markets, as the economy grows, so do the house prices. Yep, the land bankers always win. They effectively take the booty for themselves. That's what you get with a never-ending bidding war. Can you see how important it is to get rid of the MULs if you ever want to see real affordable housing? And what I mean by affordable housing is affordable housing of the type that people actually want, not just affordable modified garages or the near equivalent. Land price inflation is not the only evil giving us a housing market that looks nothing like Houston's market. But it is indeed the biggest inflationary factor and also a prerequisite to concern ourselves with if we are to ever see affordable housing in New Zealand's metropolitan areas again. The monopoly game on land, before anything else, must be removed. Part 2. What are the planners who support MULs thinking? What is their rationale? Myth. Smart growth is wonderful because it stops sprawl and saves precious farmland. Here we have a map of the North Island of New Zealand. Take a look at the yellow areas representing the cities, and especially Auckland. These cities consume 1 part in 125, try to visualize that, 1 part in 125 of the land area covering New Zealand. And note these cities are not totally built over areas. A lot of the land within them is garden, trees and grass. Now let's take a close-up shot of Auckland, where 1/3 of the population resides. Now, assuming forced population growth with continued immigration, let's see how much sprawl we could expect to occur over the next 100 years. And that's a long time. Assuming there is no metropolitan urban limit. Here we have Auckland housing about 3 million people, assuming business as usual without the metropolitan urban limits. It expands a couple of kilometres or so from the existing fringe. Now let's step back to get it in perspective. Is that fractional increase in land over the next 100 years really too much for us to accept? Will sprawl really hurt the farming industry in that time? And will our economy not be able to evolve towards alternative industries regardless? 100 years, we'll be doing anything but farming by that stage. Probably. Does it really make sense to destroy housing affordability today when there is so obviously an abundance of land? And who said sprawl was environmentally destructive? The fact is, sprawl often supports heavily leaved, ecologically rich habitats, especially in New Zealand. Now let me give you a fast rundown on some other myths and expose the silliness used to justify the Metropolitan Urban Limits. Planners sprawl. A curious effect of making fringe land so expensive is you end up with people making giant commutes to other districts to escape the costly land. The effect of this is that we have had an explosion of lifestyle block type development. Lifestyle blocks now consume nearly 5 times the land area of our cities. So much for the MUL saving farmland. They do the opposite. Myth. Sprawl leads to greater transport costs. When cities sprawl out, they take most of the new transport demand with them as jobs and infrastructure follow the expansion. Most of the new travel demand is localised to the fringes. Only about 10% or so of people commute to the CBD in Auckland and comparable cities. This is why low-density cities have the same or better transport efficiencies as high-density cities. High-density cities tend to be plagued with congestion, I'll add, because you're concentrating more and more cars and more people over a given restricted area. Myth. Sprawl costs a lot more money in new infrastructure. It costs far more money to go through the demolish and rebuild phase of building for higher densities as compared to building simple add-ons at the fringes. Regardless, it's not the place of planners to tell people how to spend their own money. If people want to buy low density, then that should be their choice. So long as, of course, they pay their own way on a level economic playing field. Myth. We need to build for higher densities to accommodate future demand. No, we don't. If we need more and smaller houses in the future as household sizes shrink, if they do, then we can just convert existing homes into 2 small flats, like we often do today. Low-density housing is flexible. Myth. Smart growth cities are healthier to live in. There was a recent article published by Scientific American Mind, February 2013, titled Big City Blues. The publishers made the alarming discovery that you can literally tell the difference between a city dweller's brain and a country person's brain, just by looking at their brains under scans. The following gives the basic findings. Metropolitan populations are significantly more likely than rural ones to suffer from mental illnesses such as depression and schizophrenia. Among urban dwellers, social stress leads to hyperactivity in the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex, brain regions that play an important role in equilibrating our emotions. The pressures of city life can change brain physiology, thereby increasing the risk of emotional disorders. But the smart growth planners assume we will get more exercise in a hyper-urban, compact city, because we supposedly have to walk everywhere. They ignore that there are many ways in which people can get their exercise. I'll leave it at that. Myth. The people want the smart growth vision. No, they don't. Take a look at this survey, which is representative of real demand. Over 80% of the market wants to live in a detached home as a natural preference. The best justification for smart growth. It might not be the intended goal of the planners, but the best justification for smart growth would have to be population control. It financially attacks the fertile population most of all, making it hard for couples to have more than 1 or 2 children, if that. I myself prefer the idea of direct controls on human breeding if we ever come to this pressing need. Part 3. A new vision for urban development, a vision based on the future, not the past. Houses, for a given capacity, actually have a somewhat small footprint. especially if they are 2 or 3 stories, of course. And whether you sprawl out or go for infill or townhouse development, they will consume the same land regardless. What makes sprawl more costly in terms of land consumption overall is, of course, the need for extensive roading. So the question is, can the need for roading and low-density developments be mitigated, and to what degree? Let me show you a model from an old post of mine titled The Future Green Sprawl, and it's a great post if I may say so. I recommend you Google for it later on when you find the time. Okay, the green represents rugged plant life, the orange represents the houses, the blue the one-way road network, I'll speak about that later. The orange fined lined areas represent the scenic walkways, and the white represents private garden and lawn. So this model is incredibly green. Now, the roading in this model development supports no parking in garages, the roading is one way, and the only cars that operate on it are driverless cars that can now, believe it or not, be bought off the shelf. Namely, I'm referring to systems such as the Ultra PRT system, which is now operating in Heathrow Airport. What this means is that roads in a new low-density development can be reduced in width to that of a footpath, and can ultimately be built at a fraction of the cost of conventional roading. Without going into details, these systems are perfectly workable for low-speed applications and new property developments. These ultra cars are fully automated taxi service, that's how they work, so you don't have to ride with strangers. They're totally private. They can also make your housing development silent and exceptionally beautiful. Potentially, they can reduce transport costs and transport energy consumption to about 10% of what is typical today within a new low-density development, completely eliminating the environmental argument for outlawing sprawl. This is just one example of the many things that can be done to make sprawl only environmentally beneficial. Where is the conversation on improving sprawl rather than just outlawing it? We never seem to get that from the smart growth planners. They don't want to know. The only option they can think of, and the only so-called solution to a so-called problem they can think of, is force intensifying a city. When you look at all the facts and all the opportunities with new urban design, you can see why they call smart growth smart growth. I would say to hide the fact that it's dumb as hell. Conclusion. A lot of people have been saying that creating affordable housing is a complex problem. That is nonsense. We've been doing affordable housing for years in times past, and it's still being done everywhere throughout the world today. It is simple. What is complex is the politics behind it. I won't go into the politics because it's strenuous and depressing, but I will just make the statement. Don't vote for any politician or political party who is not dedicated to annihilating the Metropolitan Urban Limits. This issue is too huge. The only political party that fits that bill today is ACT, though the National Party seems to be less than happy with the MULs as well, I must include. Also, keep a close look at what your local politicians stand for. These guys have done more damage to this country over the last 10 to 20 years than what your central government has done. If your local politicians start affectionately talking about sustainable cities and world-class cities, etc., and talk about providing choice where choices have obviously been taken away, then you can know that they are smart growth people. Oh, and there's nothing world-class about a city that no one can afford to buy a home in. Thank you.